The lie she lived tasted like ash and stale bread. Today, it tasted like fear. Arya's hands, raw and red from the lye soap, trembled as she stacked the polished silver plates. Each one was a perfect, cold mirror, reflecting 100 distorted versions of her face, a ghost in a servant's drab gray dress. Today was the sovereign's feast, the one night the entire kingdom held its breath, and her only goal was to be less than a shadow, to be nothing at all. She needed to survive this night, because her escape pouch hidden behind a loose stone in the wall was finally heavy enough. Just a little more. More importantly, every clatter of a plate, every shouted order from the head housekeeper, felt like a drumbeat counting down to her doom. Maybe it was fate that the feast always fell on the anniversary of the day he left, the day the world had ended. "You, girl, stop dawdling!" Mistress Alara snapped, her voice as sharp as a freshly honed knife. "You're on duty in the Great Hall, low table, East Wing, and don't you dare drop anything this time." Relief, sharp and sudden, made Arya's knees weak. Thank the goddess. The East Wing was a dark, forgotten corner, a place for minor lords with failing lands and even smaller reputations. It was perfect. A place to be invisible. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the stone floor. "Yes, mistress." As she scurried away, her worn-out leather shoes slapping softly against the cold stone, she passed a pair of younger kitchen maids, their hands deep in a tub of flour. "Have you seen the king today?" one whispered, her voice full of girlish awe. "He looks sadder than usual, so cold." The other sighed dreamily. "It's because he hasn't found his mate. Can you imagine? An alpha king, the most powerful in the 5 kingdoms, without his other half. They say his wolf is always just raging under his skin. That's why he's so harsh." Arya's chest ached. A cold weight settled deep in her bones, a familiar phantom she had carried for 8 long years. She didn't need to imagine his wolf. She remembered it. And that memory was a wound that refused to heal, which meant she had to get off this island. Now.
The crown felt heavier today. King Lucian stood before the grand library window, his gaze fixed not on the sprawling kingdom below, but on the intricate tapestry that dominated the far wall. It depicted a forest scene, but at its heart was a single, ancient willow tree, its long, weeping branches a perfect, painful replica of the one that grew by the stream where he'd made a promise he was forced to break. Behind him, his commander and oldest friend Ronan cleared his throat. "The council grows restless, Lucian. Duke Alaric was asking questions again this morning." Lucian's jaw tightened. He didn't need to turn to know the look on Ronan's face, a mixture of loyalty and deep concern. "What kind of questions?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "The usual," Ronan said, his tone carefully neutral. "About the kingdom's future, about you, not having a chosen mate, an heir. He says a king with no queen is a king with a divided soul, and that it makes our kingdom vulnerable." A muscle feathered in Lucian's cheek. "Alaric is a snake, and his daughter Seraphina is his venom. He wants his bloodline on that throne, and that's why you need to secure it with your own." Ronan stepped forward, his voice dropping. "There are other pacts, other noble bloodlines. A strategic marriage would silence Alaric for good. It would show strength, unity. No." The word was absolute, final. It was stone and iron and the fury of his wolf. Ronan fell silent. He knew better than to push. Still, after a moment, he spoke again, his voice softer. "Is this about—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Lucian's gaze remained fixed on the tapestry, the willow, her smiling face dappled in sunlight, the feel of her small hand in his, a promise made by a boy, a promise broken by a king. His first act as alpha of his pack had been to save his kingdom, by shattering his own soul. He had chosen duty over destiny, and every day since had been a quiet, cold hell. Deep down, he knew the truth. He had done it to protect her, because the threats against his succession had been very real, and she had been the perfect vulnerable target. To keep her safe, he had to cut her out of his life, pretending she meant nothing. It was a lie that choked him daily. What's worse, he knew she was still here, in this very palace. A servant, unmarked, unclaimed. The thought of it, the shame, it was a fire in his blood. "The discussion is over, Ronan," Lucian said, finally turning from the window, his eyes blazing with a cold, golden light that was more wolf than man. "I will deal with Duke Alaric in my own way." He would not bind himself to another, not while his soul still screamed for the one he'd lost. He just hoped she had forgotten him, even though the thought of it was a blade twisting in his gut.
The great hall was a beast made of gold and noise. Hundreds of candles burned in massive iron chandeliers, their light glinting off jewels and polished armor and teeth bared in false smiles. The air, thick with the scents of roasted boar and spiced wine and too much perfume, was suffocating. Arya moved through it all like a mouse in a den of lions, her tray held high, her eyes cast down. Her heart hammered against her ribs with every step. With every heartbeat, the memory of those gossiping maids echoed in her head. A king with no queen. She saw him then, on the high throne, raised above everyone else. King Lucian. Her breath caught. Even from across the hall, his presence was a physical weight. He wasn't the lanky boy she remembered from the shade of the willow tree. No. This was a man forged from steel and shadow. His black hair was pushed back from a face that looked carved from stone, and he wore the crown not as an ornament but as a weapon. His golden eyes swept across the room with a predator's intensity, and she felt a primal urge to hide, to run. So she focused on her task. She reached the dim corner of the east wing, serving wine to a grumbling, red-faced lord. He didn't even look at her. Perfect. She was just a pair of hands, nothing more. As she turned to leave, her gaze was snagged by the table nearest the throne. Duke Alaric sat there, his silver hair gleaming, a smug satisfaction on his thin lips. And beside him sat his daughter, Lady Seraphina. She was beautiful, dressed in a gown the color of blood, her smile sharp and cruel. She was positioned perfectly for the king to see, a jewel on display. Truth be told, they were a perfect match of ice and stone. Arya felt a cold dread pool in her stomach. That was the future queen. The woman who would sit beside the boy who had promised her forever. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. She turned, her movements quick, desperate to retreat to the kitchens where she could breathe again, where the ghosts didn't have golden eyes. But then, a silk-slippered foot shot out from a nearby table. Without warning, her ankle twisted. The world tilted. In the span of a breath, the heavy silver tray flew from her hands. Time stood still. The crash was like a thunderclap in a silent church. Wine splashed across the stone floor like blood. Shattered goblets skittered across the marble. And every single person in the great hall turned to look at her. Laughter, high and sharp, erupted from Lady Seraphina's table. "Clumsy kitchen rat," she sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence that followed was worse. A thick, heavy blanket of scorn and judgment. Arya's face burned with a humiliation so hot it felt like a physical blow. Her dress was soaked, her hands were shaking, and 1,000 pairs of eyes were dissecting her. Without thinking, her body moved on instinct, trying to shrink, to disappear. Before she could move to scramble away, one of Seraphina's friends lunged forward and with a triumphant smirk ripped the sleeve of her simple gray dress, exposing her shoulder. A gasp went through the crowd, not of sympathy, of amusement. Tears pricked at Arya's eyes, hot and shameful. She squeezed them shut, her world narrowing to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the cruel, echoing laughter. She didn't know what scared her more, the crushing humiliation or the sudden, absolute silence that fell over the entire hall, so profound it was like the world had stopped breathing. Because in that moment, a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't a word. It was a growl. Low, guttural, and full of a rage so primal it shook the very stones of the castle. When her name left his lips, whispered like a prayer and a curse, her whole world shattered. Arya. That sound, it wasn't human. It was the sound of a storm breaking, of the earth splitting open. A deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the stone floor and up into her very bones. Her bones remembered him. The entire glittering, mocking hall fell into a silence so deep it was louder than the laughter had been. And then, his voice. Her name. Arya. It wasn't the voice of the boy who'd whispered secrets to her under a willow tree. This voice was deeper, harder, laced with a fury that promised violence. Yet underneath it all there was a raw, aching note of something she couldn't, or wouldn't, name. As if pulled by a string, every head in the room turned towards the throne. And he was moving. He didn't walk. He descended the dais like a predator, a great black wolf in the shape of a man. The crowd, full of proud alphas and sneering nobles, parted for him like frightened sheep. In fact, they scrambled to get out of his way. His golden eyes, glowing with an inner fire, were locked on her, only her, as if the world had narrowed to the space between them, a disgraced servant on her hands and knees and the king who was coming for her. Her breath caught. Her thoughts spun into chaos. No, 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 not now. Not like this. In a single heartbeat, he was there, a mountain of shadow and rage standing over her. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't speak. Instead, in one fluid motion, he shrugged off his own immense cloak, a magnificent thing of black fur and deep crimson velvet, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The weight of it was a shock, a sudden, heavy comfort. But then came the scent. His scent. Pine and winter air and something else. Something wild and male and so achingly familiar it felt like a punch to the gut. It was the scent of every good memory she had, now tainted by this public spectacle. As the echo of his voice faded, she was drowning in him. With his scent in the air, he took her arm, his grip firm, and pulled her to her feet. His touch was lightning on her skin. She stumbled, and his arm went around her, holding her steady against his hard chest, trapping her. The space between them burned. Her heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. From this close, she could see the fury in his eyes wasn't for her. No, it was for them, for everyone else. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the silent court, over a pale-faced Duke Alaric, and finally landing on a stunned Lady Seraphina. "She is under my protection," Lucian's voice rang out, each word a block of ice, laced with the undeniable power of his alpha command. "Anyone who harms her, who insults her, who so much as looks at her with malice, will answer directly to me." The tension broke. The implicit threat was not just a warning, it was a promise of death. He looked down at her then, and for a fleeting second, just a second, the fury in his eyes softened into something else, something that looked terrifyingly like regret. Without another word, he signaled to the royal guard. "Take her to the queen's chambers. See that she is not disturbed."
The moment the goblet shattered, something inside him snapped. It was a clean, sharp break. The king, the strategist, the cold-blooded ruler he had forced himself to become, simply ceased to exist. In his place, the wolf surged forward, a tidal wave of possessive, primal rage. He heard the laughter, Seraphina's sharp and ugly, and it was like acid on his soul. He saw them rip her dress, saw the pale, perfect skin of her shoulder, and the world went red at the edges. A growl ripped from his throat, a sound he hadn't let escape in years, not since he was a boy learning his strength. It wasn't a choice. It was instinct. Mine. The word was a brand on his soul. Mine to protect. Mine to cherish. Mine to claim. And he had failed. He had left her to be torn at by these jackals. The guilt was a physical agony. far worse than any blade. As he moved through the court, their fear was a satisfying scent in the air. He wanted them to be afraid. He wanted them to know that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Because of that, he let his wolf look out through his eyes, letting them see the predator he kept leashed. But then he saw her, on the floor, trembling, broken, trying to hide her face. The sight of her tears extinguished the rage and replaced it with a desperate, soul-crushing ache. This was his fault, all of it. His cloak was the only thing he could think to offer. It was a symbol of his power, of his position. Draping it over her, covering her in his scent, was a public declaration. More than words, it said, "She belongs to me." He felt a tremor go through her as he pulled her to her feet, and the fragile warmth of her body against his was a homecoming he hadn't realized he was starving for. His wolf purred deep in his chest, a rumbling thunder only he could feel. Mate is here, safe. But she wasn't safe. Not yet. That's why he had to face them. He met Alaric's cold, calculating stare without flinching. The Duke's eyes were full of fury, but also a flicker of triumph, as if this was a move in a game, and Lucian had just made a predictable emotional error. What's worse, Lucian knew the Duke was right. This was a mistake. A king didn't show this kind of weakness, this kind of blatant favoritism. A king didn't choose a servant over a strategic alliance, but the wolf didn't care about politics. "She is under my protection," he declared, his voice imbued with the force of his will. He watched the words land, saw the fear blossom on Seraphina's face, and felt a grim satisfaction. He had drawn the line. He ordered her taken to the Queen's chambers, not a guest room, the Queen's chambers. The symbolism was a battering ram against the gates of courtly protocol. Let them whisper, let them plot. He didn't care. In that moment he had only one goal. He would burn down his entire kingdom to keep her safe.
The walk through the palace was a blur of horrified, fascinated faces. Whispers followed her like snakes slithering through grass. She was no longer Arya the servant. She was the king's property. The thought made her feel sick. The royal guards, men who had never once looked at her, now flanked her with a grim reverence, their armor clinking with each step. They led her up winding marble staircases, through halls hung with ancient tapestries, and into the forbidden territory of the royal wing. The door they opened for her was carved from pale golden wood. The room beyond, it stole her breath. It was vast. A fire crackled in a hearth big enough to stand in. A bed piled high with silk cushions and fur blankets sat on a raised platform like an altar. Moonlight streamed through a stained glass window, painting the floor in jewels of blue and violet. It was the most beautiful room she had ever seen, and it was a cage. The heavy door clicked shut behind her. A moment later, she heard the definitive metallic thunk of an external lock sliding into place. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. Her body moved on instinct. She ran to the door, her hands fumbling with the ornate golden handle. It wouldn't turn. She beat on the wood, her fists making a dull, pathetic sound. "Let me out, please." Silence. Her breath came in ragged sobs. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room, searching for another way out. The window? It overlooked a sheer drop of at least 100 feet. There was no escape. She caught her reflection in a tall, silver-backed mirror leaning against the wall. A small, wild-eyed girl swallowed whole by the king's enormous black cloak. His scent was everywhere, on her skin, in her hair, a constant, suffocating reminder. He hadn't rescued her. He had captured her. He had dragged her from the quiet misery she had carefully built for herself and thrown her into the center of the storm. Why? As a game? A way to spite his court? The humiliation from the feast was a fading ember, but in its place, a new fire was kindling. A cold, hard, furious flame. He had broken her heart once, abandoning her without a word. She had spent 8 years learning to survive that wound, learning to be numb. She would not let him break her again. Her tears dried. Her trembling stopped. She straightened her back, the fur of his cloak feeling less like a shield and more like armor. Deep down, she knew the truth. Lucian hadn't come for a servant girl he once knew. He had come for a possession he had misplaced, and she would rather die than be his toy. The fight was just beginning. Come morning, the world had changed, or rather, her cage had been gilded. Sunlight, thick and golden, poured through the stained glass window, but it offered no warmth. Arya hadn't slept. Instead, she'd spent the night wrapped in a silk blanket by the cold hearth, Lucian's heavy cloak a discarded beast in the corner. She felt exposed, watched. Even in the opulent silence, the whispers from the great hall seemed to echo off the walls. Moments later, a soft knock preceded the door swinging open, not with a key, but with a quiet click, which meant it hadn't been locked all night. The illusion of escape, a crueler prison than any real lock. 3 women entered. They were not servants like her. They were ladies-in-waiting, their silk gowns rustling like dry leaves, their faces smooth, polite masks. "The king has commanded us to attend you," the eldest one said, her voice like honey laced with frost. Her name was Lady Isolde. Before she could protest, they were on her, a flurry of efficient, impersonal hands. They stripped her of her ruined servant's dress and bathed her in a copper tub with water that smelled of lavender and roses. They brushed her long, dark hair until it shone, their touch gentle but their eyes were cold, appraising. As if she were a horse they were grooming for auction. "The king has chosen a gown for you," the youngest one, Alara, chirped, holding up a dress of deep forest green velvet. It was beautiful. More beautiful than anything she had ever dared to dream of touching. And she hated it. "I don't want it," Arya said, her voice a rough whisper. Lady Isolde simply smiled, a thin, knowing curve of her lips. "You misunderstand, dear. It was not a request." With every layer of silk and velvet they dressed her in, her own identity felt like it was being stripped away. She was being erased, remade into his doll, his pet. She saw it in their eyes. She wasn't a person to them. She was a royal curiosity. Maybe it was fate that she would end her days as a plaything. To make things worse, as Alara was fastening a simple silver chain around her neck, her hand slipped. A pitcher of cool water on a nearby table tilted, spilling its contents down the front of the exquisite gown. Alara gasped, a fake, theatrical sound. "Oh, my apologies. How clumsy of me." Lady Isolde tutted, dabbing at the dark, spreading stain with a silk cloth. "It seems you can take the girl out of the scullery," she began, her voice dripping with condescending pity, before she trailed off, her eyes flicking towards the door. Arya didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She didn't give them the satisfaction. Deep down, she knew the truth. This was a test, the first of many. She just stood there, her chin held high, the cold water soaking through to her skin, and met their reflections in the mirror with a gaze as cold and hard as the winter stones of this castle. She would not break.
He stood outside her door for a long time, the polished wood feeling like a mountain between them. What could he possibly say? "I'm sorry I destroyed your life, abandoned you, and then dragged you back into the fire." The words tasted like poison in his mouth. He had spent the night in the throne room, the crown resting on the arm of his chair, the silence his only companion. He had replayed the moment at the feast 1,000 times. The primal, possessive roar of his wolf. The public declaration. He had acted on pure instinct. And now, in the cold light of day, the king had to deal with the consequences. Duke Alaric would already be plotting, using Lucian's emotional outburst as proof of his unfitness to rule. Because of that, he had to make Arya understand, not just for her safety, but for his own sanity. He needed her to see that this was the only way. Eventually, he pushed the door open. She was standing by the window, already dressed in the green gown he had chosen for her, the color of the forest where they had met. She looked magnificent, a queen in all but name. But her posture was rigid, her arms crossed over her chest, a dark, wet stain marring the front of her dress. Her eyes, when she turned to look at him, were not the warm, laughing eyes of his memory. They were chips of ice. "What do you want?" she asked. The question was a shard of glass. The air thickened. He took a step forward. "Arya, I am sorry. For last night. For everything." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Sorry? You're sorry you paraded me in front of your whole court like a prize you'd won?" His chest ached. "I was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Her voice rose, shaking with a fury she wasn't trying to hide. "You humiliated me. You locked me in this room. This isn't protection, Lucian. It's possession." The sound of his name on her lips, twisted with such hatred, was a physical blow. "You don't understand," he said, his voice pleading. "There are threats, people who would use you to hurt me, to destabilize the kingdom." He tried to explain, to tell her about the vipers in his court, about the whispers of rebellion, about the danger she was truly in. He offered her anything she wanted: wealth, titles, a position of power, anything to keep her here, where he could see her, where he could keep her safe. But then she looked him straight in the eye, her expression completely shuttered, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "I want nothing from you." The words hit him harder than any physical attack. The wolf inside him whimpered, a wounded, beaten thing. She took a step closer, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "Let me leave." He stared at her, at the fierce, unbroken spirit he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the spirit he was now forced to crush. In that moment, he realized his mistake. He thought his power could fix this, but his power was the very thing that had broken them in the first place. "I can't," he finally said, his own voice hollow. "Why not?" she demanded. He looked at her, his heart shattering. "Because to let you go now," he paused, the truth a terrible weight, "is to feed you to the wolves." And he would not let that happen.
His words were just another bar on the cage. To feed you to the wolves. As if he were the noble protector and not the zookeeper. An hour later, Lady Isolde returned. "The king requests your presence in the royal gardens." It wasn't a request. Arya knew that. It was a summons. She was to be paraded again, this time in the open air, a public display of the king's new pet. She walked beside him in silence, her head held high, forcing her face into a mask of serene indifference. She wouldn't let them see her fear. She wouldn't let him see it. The gardens were beautiful, a riot of color and scent that felt like a mockery of her inner turmoil. But with every step he took, she felt the eyes of the court on her. They were everywhere, on balconies, strolling along parallel paths, sitting on stone benches, whispering, pointing, judging. This was worse than the Great Hall. In here, there were no shadows to hide in. Without warning, a trio of figures rounded a hedge of white roses. Lady Seraphina. Her smile was poison. She stopped directly in front of them, performing a deep, elaborate curtsy that was an insult in itself. "Your Majesty," she purred, her eyes on Lucienne. Then, her gaze slid to Arya, and her eyes glittered with malice. She looked Arya up and down, from her velvet dress to her plain shoes. And company. Lucien's hand twitched at his side. A low, barely audible growl rumbled in his chest. "Seraphina." His voice was a warning. But she wasn't finished. Leaning in as if to share a secret, she whispered to Arya, her voice just loud enough for Lucian to hear. "Enjoy the sun while you can, little mouse. The king tires of his toys so very quickly." Her instincts surged. Arya felt a growl rise in her own throat, a shocking, feral impulse she quickly swallowed. She wouldn't give them a reaction. She wouldn't. Yet, as Serafina and her friends swept away, their laughter trailing behind them like a foul scent, the mask Arya wore cracked. The carefully constructed wall around her heart trembled. As the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words, she turned to Lucian, her control finally snapping. Her voice was a fierce, shaking whisper, for his ears only. "Your protection feels like a cage, Your Majesty." She looked him dead in the eye, letting all her bitterness and fury bleed into her words. "And your court. Your court are the animals you've trapped me with."
Her words were a slap, sharp and true. "Your court are the animals you've trapped me with." And he had no defense, because she was right. He left her in the gardens, the scent of roses and her fury clinging to him. He retreated not to his chambers, but to the council hall, a place of cold stone and even colder politics. He needed the chill of it, the hard reality, to chase away the ache in his chest. Truth be told, he needed to remember he was a king. But then, Duke Alaric made it impossible to forget. The moment Lucian took his seat on the throne, the Duke rose, his expression a perfect mask of solemn concern. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice smooth and oily, carrying to every corner of the silent chamber. "I speak for several concerned members of this council when I say that the stability of the kingdom is our primary concern." Lucian's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his throne. "Get to your point, Alaric." "My point, Your Majesty," Alaric said, his voice hardening just a fraction, "is your unfortunate obsession with the servant girl." A low murmur rippled through the assembled lords. "Her name is Arya," Lucian growled, the sound low and dangerous. The wolf stirred, its hackles rising. "Arya," Alaric conceded with a dismissive wave. "The name is irrelevant. What is relevant is that your judgment appears compromised. You have publicly shamed a noble house." He gestured to where Lady Serafina's father sat looking thunderous, "and elevated a commoner for reasons no one can fathom. Rumors are spreading through the palace, Your Majesty. Vicious rumors." Lucian's jaw was so tight it ached. "What rumors?" "That she is an enchantress," Alaric said, his eyes glittering. "That she has used some sort of dark magic to bewitch you, to cloud your mind. A king ruled by an unnatural passion is not a king who can rule at all." He let the words hang in the air, a direct, undeniable challenge to Lucian's authority. Not only that, he was using Lucian's own actions as the weapon. He was unfit, the Duke claimed, because his love for this girl made him a danger to them all. What's worse, he could see it on their faces. The doubt, the fear, the flicker of agreement. His court was a pack of wolves, and they could smell blood in the water. His blood. He had never felt so alone on his throne.
The gilded cage had become an echo chamber. She was a prisoner in the most beautiful room in the kingdom, and the only news she got of the outside world came from the venomous whispers of the ladies-in-waiting. And those whispers were turning her into a monster. "They say she's a witch," she heard Alara, the youngest one, say to another just outside her door. "That she brewed a potion to ensnare the king's heart." "I heard," the other replied, her voice hushed, "that she met him in the woods as a child and made a pact with dark spirits to bind his soul to hers." Arya stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself, listening to them build her into a villain, piece by poisonous piece. This was Duke Alaric's work. She knew it. He wasn't just trying to discredit her. He was trying to erase her, to paint over the real girl with the image of a sorceress so that when he finally destroyed her, no one would mourn. In the span of a breath, her fear began to curdle into a cold, hard rage. They could call her a mouse. They could call her a servant. She had endured that, but she would not let them call her this. She would not let them twist the one pure thing she had ever known, her childhood with Lucian, into something ugly and profane. Later that afternoon, she was allowed a supervised walk. As she passed through a service corridor, she saw a familiar face. an older servant named Lyra, a woman with kind eyes who had once shared a piece of bread with her when she was new and starving. Arya opened her mouth to speak, a hopeful, desperate word. But then, Lyra's eyes widened in fear. The woman spat on the stone floor near Arya's feet, turned and scurried away as if Arya were carrying a plague. The spit felt like a physical blow. In that moment, something inside her shifted. Her goal was no longer to escape this palace. No. Her goal was to burn down the lies. And that fire started with the king. That night, when he came to her chambers, he found her pacing like a caged wolf. The moment their eyes locked, the tension broke. "Are you enjoying the show?" she demanded, her voice shaking with repressed fury. "Is this what you wanted? Your whole court thinks I'm a witch who has you under a spell." His face was a mask of exhaustion and pain. "Arya, please. No," she cried, taking a step toward him. "Don't you, Arya, please me. You did this. You dragged me into the light so they could all tear me apart." "I did it to protect you," he roared, his control finally snapping, his voice echoing with the power of the Alpha. The sound shook her, but she didn't back down. "You've said that already," she shot back. "And it's a lie. You left me once before without a word to protect your precious crown. Now you want me back as a pet to prove you can have it all. The crown and the girl. Well, I won't be your pet, Lucian. I won't be your anything." He stared at her, his golden eyes blazing, a terrible, wounded look on his face. As the silence stretched, he seemed to break. You truly think I left you for this?" he asked, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He gestured around the opulent room, a look of pure disgust on his face. "For this crown? This cage?" Before she could answer, he crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. He gripped her by the arms, his touch surprisingly gentle, but his eyes were full of a desperate, terrifying fire. The air thickened, crackling with a pain so old it felt like it was part of the castle's stones. "They were going to kill you, Arya," he said, his voice dropping, each word a heavy stone sinking in a deep, dark pool. Her breath caught. The world tilted. "Alaric's faction. They knew about us. They knew you were my only weakness. The letter was already written. The threat was made. They were going to kill you and make it look like an accident to prove I couldn't even protect my own." His grip tightened, his gaze boring into her, forcing her to see the truth he had hidden for 8 years. "So yes, I left. I walked away without a word. I let you hate me." A single perfect tear traced a path down his cheek. Because a broken heart was better than a grave. Her own heart skipped. He was lying. He had to be. Her entire world, the entire fortress of anger she had built around her heart, was built on the foundation of his betrayal. Without it, what was left? Her voice trembled. You expect me to believe you?" He left her with those words hanging in the air, a ghost that would not be banished. A broken heart was better than a grave. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. And yet, the memory of his face, the raw agony in his eyes, the single tear that had escaped his iron control, it played over and over in her mind. Could he have faked that? Could the cold, hard king she knew now even be capable of such a perfect performance? She spent the next day in a fog, refusing food, ignoring the ladies-in-waiting. Her mind was a battlefield. One part of her clung to the familiar, righteous anger of the abandoned girl. The other, a smaller, more treacherous part, whispered, "What if he's telling the truth?" That evening, there was a knock on her door. She expected Lucian, braced for another battle, another round of heart-wrenching arguments. But it wasn't him. It was Ronan, his commander. He stood in the doorway, his face as grim and unreadable as ever, his presence filling the space. He gave a short, formal bow. "My lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "May I have a word?" She nodded numbly, stepping back to let him in. He was the king's shadow, his most loyal soldier. Of course, he would be here to support his master's lies. The king did not send me, Ronan said, as if reading her thoughts. He remained standing, a pillar of dark leather and steel in the center of her room. I came because there are things you need to know. Arya crossed her arms, her skepticism a thin shield. And what things are those? The truth, he said simply. He looked at her, his gaze steady, and she saw not a hint of deception, only a deep, weary loyalty. I was the one who intercepted the letter 8 years ago. I brought it to him. Her chest ached. What did it say? Ronan's eyes darkened with the memory. It was specific. It described the willow tree by the stream. It described you. It said that a boy who couldn't protect a single Omega girl could never hope to protect an entire kingdom. And it said your life would be the first price of his failure. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He was just a boy then, Arya. His claim to the alpha position was not secure. Alaric had supporters. If he had publicly claimed you then, it would have started a civil war. They would have killed you on the first day, and he would have been powerless to stop it. As the truth unraveled, something inside her cracked. The image of the laughing boy and the cold, distant king merged into a single, tragic figure, a boy who had been forced to make an impossible choice. So he chose the kingdom, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. No, Ronan corrected her, his voice softening for the first time. He chose you. He chose your life. He built this cold, hard kingdom on the foundation of that sacrifice. He's never been the same since. As if the forest watched, the wind outside the window howled, a lonely, mournful sound. Ronan took a step toward the door. I tell you this now for one reason, he said, his hand on the handle. He turned back, his eyes boring into hers, full of a grim, terrible warning. The Duke is more dangerous now than he was then. He let that sink in. Because you are no longer a secret. As the truth unraveled, the anger that had been her shield for 8 years shattered into 1,000 useless pieces. It had kept her warm, that righteous fury. It had been her armor. Now, she stood in the silence of her chambers, utterly exposed, the cold weight of Ronan's warning settling over her. You are no longer a secret. What followed was a long, dark night of the soul. She was not the victim of a simple, cruel betrayal. No. She was the survivor of a sacrifice. Lucian hadn't thrown her away. He had cut out a piece of his own soul to keep her safe. And she had hated him for it. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, was a far heavier burden than anger had ever been. So, when he came to her chambers the next evening, she was not pacing. She was not waiting for a fight. She was sitting by the window, watching the last rays of sun bleed across the sky, and she was thinking. She had spent her life being invisible, hiding, observing. It was a skill born of fear, but maybe it could be a weapon. He stopped just inside the door, his posture wary, clearly expecting another storm. Arya? She turned to face him. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, steady. Tell me about your court. He blinked, confusion clouding his golden eyes. What? Your court, she repeated, rising to her feet. The people in it. Tell me about them. Who is loyal? Who is ambitious? Who fears Alaric more than they respect their king? Between one breath and the next, the entire dynamic between them shifted. He took a hesitant step forward, hope and disbelief warring on his face. Why are you asking this? Because, she said, her gaze unwavering, for 8 years I have been a ghost in these halls. I have served their wine and cleared their plates and listened to their secrets when they thought no one was around. I know which guards watch the Duke's hands instead of yours for a signal. I know which of Seraphina's ladies-in-waiting has the sharpest ears and the loosest tongue. I know things a queen would never see. She took a breath. The words a vow. I will not be the weakness he uses to destroy you, so instead, let me be your dagger. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. The guarded king, the cold alpha, vanished. In his place was Lucian. Just Lucian. His eyes shone with a raw, vulnerable light that stole her breath. You see things I have been blind to, he whispered, the admission a crack in his armor. Then let me help you see, she replied. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It was something far more powerful. It was an alliance.
Her words, they were a balm on a wound he thought would never heal. Let me be your dagger. Not a victim to be protected, but a weapon at his side. His wolf, the sullen, raging beast that had paced the cage of his ribs for years, settled. It recognized the queen in her, the true mate, fierce and clever and unbroken. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar feeling, surged through him. He will make his next move in the council, Lucian found himself saying, his mind racing, their plan already taking shape. He feels his power growing. He will challenge me again. Then let him, Arya said, a strange, hard light in her eyes. Give him the stage, and I will give the court a show. That's why, 2 days later, he called an emergency session. The pretext was a border dispute, a flimsy excuse, and everyone knew it. The air in the council hall was thick with tension. Alaric sat at the head of the long table, smug and confident, ready for a fight. And Lucian gave it to him. He allowed the debate to wander, allowed Alaric to dominate the conversation, to subtly paint him as a distracted, emotional king. While our king is preoccupied, Alaric said, his voice dripping with false deference, our enemies at the border grow bold. We need a leader with a clear mind, an undivided soul. Right on cue, the great hall doors swung open. Silence. Every head turned. Arya stood there, framed in the doorway. She wasn't dressed as a royal, but in a simple, elegant gown of dark blue. She looked neither like a servant nor a queen. She looked like herself, strong, resolute. She walked into the room, her steps silent and sure, and every eye followed her. She stopped beside Lucian's throne. He had not told her to do this, not exactly. This was all her. Lord Alaric, she said, her voice clear and calm, carrying to every corner of the room. You speak of witchcraft and spells. Alaric sneered. I speak of the king's health, girl. Do you? Arya tilted her head. Because I heard a different story. In fact, just yesterday I was speaking with Lady Alara. I was so distraught I told her I feared the king was going to send me away to the Silent Sisters convent in the northern peaks. Lucian held his breath. He saw Alaric's eyes flicker. He saw the trap. Arya's gaze swept the room. A secret I told only to her. And yet, Lord Alaric, my sources tell me you were comforting Lord Mathis this very morning, assuring him that your influence would soon see the king's enchantress sent to a convent in the northern peaks. The hall was utterly still. Lady Alara, Seraphina's friend, went pale as milk. You see, Arya continued, her voice soft but lethal, I have never been to the northern peaks. I told Lady Alara I was to be sent to the Sunstone Abbey in the south. A small detail to change, isn't it? She looked directly at Alaric, her eyes like chips of flint. Unless the only way you could have known about my exile was if your spy reported the lie, a lie you then repeated. The trap snapped shut. She had exposed his spy and his methods in one clean, brilliant move. More importantly, she had proven she was no witless toy. A few of the lords, those who valued cleverness over brute force, looked at her with a newfound grudging respect. But the look on Duke Alaric's face, it was no longer political. It was not the face of a man who had lost a debate. It was the face of a man who had been publicly gutted. It was the face of a murderer.
The victory felt like a gulp of fresh air after years of drowning. But the air was thin and the fall was a long way down. She felt the danger now, a cold tingling on her skin. She had made it personal. She left the council hall, needing a moment of quiet, and took a long, winding route back to her chambers through a deserted West Wing corridor. The stone walls were lined with ancient, faded tapestries depicting forgotten battles. The air was cool and smelled of dust and time. Without warning, a sound from above. A strange, groaning creak of stressed rope and scraping metal. Her head snapped up. The massive iron rod holding a tapestry of a great wolf hunt was tilting. It was falling. Her mind went blank. Her feet were frozen to the floor. This was it. This was how it ended. A freak accident no one could question. But then, a roar. Not from the tapestry, but from behind her. Lucian. As if the world narrowed to a single point of impact, he slammed into her, a blur of shadow and fury. His arms wrapped around her like iron bands, lifting her off her feet and throwing them both sideways. Time stood still. They hit the stone floor hard, his body cushioning hers, the air knocked from her lungs in a painful gasp. A heartbeat later, an earth-shattering crash echoed through the corridor. The massive iron rod, thick as a man's arm, slammed into the spot where she had been standing, shattering the flagstones and sending chips of rock flying. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by their ragged breaths. "Are you hurt?" Lucian's voice was a rough rasp in her ear, his body a heavy protective weight on top of hers. "No," she choked out. "You?" "Just a scratch." But when he rolled off her, she saw it wasn't a scratch. The sleeve of his tunic was torn, and a deep, ugly gash ran down his forearm, blood welling up, dark and crimson. Her heart skipped. He was hurt. For her. Again. Without thinking, her hands went to the hem of her velvet dress. She ripped a long strip from the fabric, her fingers clumsy. "Here," she said, her voice trembling. "Let me." She knelt before him, taking his arm. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm as she wrapped the makeshift bandage around the wound. His blood was hot on her skin. The metallic scent of it filled the air, mingling with the dust and his own wild scent. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the flecks of gold in his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell, the pulse beating in his throat. The air thickened, crackling with 8 years of unspoken words, of pain and sacrifice and a longing so deep it was etched into her bones. He lifted his good hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was fire. "Aria," he breathed, his name a prayer. And then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate and hungry and full of all the fury and fear from the last few days. It was a claim. It was a surrender. And as his mouth moved over hers, something inside her that had been frozen for 8 long years finally broke. She let it happen. She kissed him back, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. The point of no return. The world outside this corridor, the Duke, the plots, the danger, it all faded away to a dull roar. There was only this, only him. They were no longer just allies. In the dust of a failed assassination, surrounded by the scent of his blood, they were finally, irrevocably, mates. The kiss had changed everything. Her world, once a monochrome of survival and fear, was now flooded with dizzying, terrifying color. She sat in her chambers, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a sanctuary. Her fingers drifted to her lips, still tender, still tasting of him, of desperation and blood and a promise she was finally ready to believe. He had shed his blood for her. He had kissed her like she was the only air in his lungs. And she had kissed him back. For the first time in 8 years, she felt a flicker of something she had long thought dead. Hope. That's why, when the heavy official knock came at her door, her heart didn't pound with fear. She thought it was him. But then, the door swung open. It wasn't Lucian. It was the captain of the Royal Guard, his face a grim, unreadable mask of duty. Behind him stood 6 guards, their armor gleaming, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. "My lady," the captain said, his voice devoid of any warmth. Lucian burst into the room from a connecting door, his arm still bandaged with the strip of her dress. "Captain, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Your Majesty," the captain said, bowing his head, but not backing down. "I act on the authority of the council and the evidence presented to it. We have a warrant to search these chambers for proof of high treason." Treason? The word was so absurd Arya almost laughed, but the look on Lucian's face, a flash of pure, murderous fury, stopped her. "This is Alaric's doing," Lucian snarled. "You will not lay a hand on anything in this room." "With respect, Your Majesty," the captain said, his voice firm. "The law is clear. I must." Before Lucian could stop them, the guards swept into the room. They were methodical, efficient. They overturned cushions, opened wardrobes, checked beneath the bed. Arya stood frozen, a cold dread beginning to seep into her bones. This was wrong. This was a trap. One of the guards pulled a small locked wooden box from a drawer. The captain took a key from his pocket, a key Arya had never seen, and opened it. He reached inside and pulled out a sheaf of letters, tied with a black ribbon. "The ink is still fresh," the captain announced, handing them to a stunned Lucien. Lucien's face went pale as he read. His hands began to shake. This is a forgery. Her handwriting—" "It is a perfect match, Your Majesty," the captain said coolly. And then he turned. His eyes scanned the room and landed on the wall near her old hiding spot. He walked over to it, his movements too certain, too precise. He pressed a stone, the one right next to hers. A hidden compartment she never knew existed slid open, and from it he pulled a small, familiar leather pouch, her escape money. He opened it, and a river of gold and silver coins spilled onto the floor, glittering like snake scales in the firelight. "Payment," the captain said, his voice ringing with finality. "From the rebel leader, Kaelin, for information on the palace's defenses. It's all in the letters." He looked at Arya, his eyes filled with a cold, impersonal pity. "Arya of the Kitchens, you are under arrest for treason against the crown." Her world tilted, then shattered. Her own dream of freedom, her secret hope, her hoarded coins, had been twisted into a noose and placed around her neck.
He was the king, and he was utterly, completely powerless. He sat on his throne, the forged letters spread on the table before him. The council chamber was a pit of vipers. He could feel their eyes on him, some fearful, some triumphant, all of them waiting. Alaric had played his hand perfectly. The evidence was a masterpiece of deceit. The handwriting was flawless. The wax seal on the letters was a perfect copy of the rebel leader's crest. And the gold, using her own pathetic savings against her, was a stroke of cruel genius. He knew it was a lie. His wolf knew. The very bond that pulsed between them, a living, breathing thing, screamed her innocence. But the king had nothing. "The evidence is undeniable," Alaric said, his voice a smooth, reasonable poison. "The girl has been plotting with our enemies. She used her position, her proximity to the throne, to gather information. She is a spy, a traitor." "She is innocent," Lucien roared, slamming his fist on the arm of the throne. The wood cracked under the force of the blow. "This is your doing, Alaric, a pathetic, transparent frame-up." "Your Majesty," an old lord named Theron said, his voice trembling slightly. "Your emotional attachment to the girl is understood, but we cannot ignore a direct threat to this kingdom for the sake of one person. The law is the law, for everyone." He looked around the room from face to face and saw no allies. He saw fear. He saw a council that was terrified of the rebels at the border, and Alaric had just handed them a perfect scapegoat. Ronan stood beside him, his hand on the hilt of his sword, his face grim. "Lucien," he murmured so low only he could hear. "They have you trapped. By law. You have no choice. You have to confine her, or they will see it as you being complicit. They'll call for your abdication." The words were like stones in his gut. His crown, or her. Alaric was forcing the choice he had run from 8 years ago. To make things worse, he had to be the one to give the order. He had to be the one to lock his own mate away. He rose to his feet, the movement stiff, pained. He looked at his council, at the men who were supposed to be his loyal advisors, and felt nothing but contempt. "Arya will be confined to the North Tower," he said, each word tasting like ash and blood. "She will be held there until a formal trial can be convened." He saw the triumphant smirk flicker across Alaric's face. He had won. He had separated them. He had used the king's own laws to put the king's mate in a cage. As Lucian walked from the chamber, the weight of the crown felt less like a symbol of power and more like a tombstone.
The trial was a farce, a perfectly orchestrated piece of theater for an audience that had already decided on the ending. She stood on a raised platform in the center of the great hall, the very spot where she had been humiliated just days before. Now, she was not an object of scorn, but of hatred. The whispers were no longer about her being a witch. They were about her being a traitor. Alaric presented his case with cold, logical precision. The letters, the gold. He twisted her past, a poor servant girl desperate for a better life, into the motive of a greedy spy willing to sell out the kingdom for coin. It was all so neat, so clean, so believable. When she was allowed to speak, her voice was a thin thread in the vast, hostile silence. "I am innocent," she said, her gaze finding Lucian on his throne. He looked like a man being carved from the inside out. "The letters are forgeries. The gold was my own savings. I was saving to leave." A ripple of mocking laughter went through the crowd. Leave? To go where? The lie sounded pathetic, even to her own ears. But then, Alaric called his final witness. "I call Lyra of the Kitchens to the stand." Arya's heart skipped. Lyra, the woman with the kind eyes. A flicker of impossible hope ignited in her chest. Maybe she would tell the truth. But the woman who took the stand was not the woman Arya remembered. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and terrified. She wouldn't look at Arya. She clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. "Tell the court what you heard, Lyra," Alaric said, his voice gentle, coaxing. Lyra took a shaky breath. I heard her," she whispered, her voice breaking. "In the kitchens, a few nights ago. I heard her whispering to herself. About Kaelin. About a plan. About getting her payment soon." She broke down into sobs, hiding her face in her hands. It was over. A lie, delivered with perfect weeping conviction. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. The sentence, read out by old Lord Theron, was a death knell. Death by beheading, for high treason against the crown. Her knees buckled. The world swam. She saw nothing but a blur of faces. But through it all, she felt his eyes. Lucian's. A silent, desperate scream passing between them. The moment stretched into an eternity. Duke Alaric, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, walked to the foot of the throne. In one hand, he held the official execution order. In the other, he held a long black quill. He knelt, offering them to his king. "Your Majesty," Alaric's voice boomed in the unnatural silence. "The law requires your seal, your signature, to carry out the sentence." Lucian did not move. He sat on his throne, a statue of a king, his face so devoid of color it looked like he was already dead. The whole world, the whole kingdom held its breath, watching, waiting for the king to sign the death warrant for the woman everyone knew he loved. The quill trembled in Alaric's outstretched hand, and deep down she knew the truth. He was the king, and the king had to follow the law. This was the end. From her cell high in the North Tower, the world was a distant, muted thing. The cold from the stone floor seeped into her bones, A final, chilling embrace. Death. The word had no meaning anymore. It was just the next thing. She had survived the gossip, the humiliation, the lies, but she would not survive the law. And yet, her mind, a traitor to her despair, refused to be still. It kept replaying the trial, sorting through the lies like a woman sorting grain. The letters, the gold, the seal, the seal. As if fate demanded it, her numb fingers began to trace patterns in the dust on the floor. Without thinking, she drew the Alaric family crest, a snarling wolf's head crowned with thorns. She knew its every line, every curve. For 8 years, she had polished that crest on the Duke's silverware until her fingers bled. She knew it better than she knew her own face. And that's when she saw it. A memory, sharp and sudden. The Duke's signet ring. The one he used to press into the hot wax of his letters. A few months ago, he had made a great show of replacing it, complaining that the old one had a tiny hairline crack in the thorn just above the wolf's left eye, a flaw so small only someone who had stared at it for hours would ever notice. But the seal on the forged letters. She had only glimpsed it at the trial, but her mind had captured the image perfectly. The crack was there. Her breath caught, her heart, a slow, dying drum, suddenly kicked against her ribs. Once. Twice. It wasn't proof. Yet. But it was a crack. A crack in the lie. A crack big enough to let a sliver of light in. To make things worse, she was trapped up here, 1,000 miles from the man who needed to know. The man who was, at this very moment, being forced to condemn her. She scrambled to the narrow, barred window. She could see the great hall below, its windows blazing with torchlight. She was out of time. He was going to sign it. Her mind raced, a frantic, desperate prayer on her lips. Don't do it, Lucian. Don't you dare break again. Fight. As though fate whispered it across the stones, she felt a shift in the air. A tremor of power that had nothing to do with the wind. It was him. It was his will. A silent roar against the world. And deep in her soul, where the ghost of their bond still lingered, she felt it, etched in fire. He was not surrendering.
The quill was a dead weight in his hand. A serpent. He stared at the execution order, at her name written in elegant, damning script. The silence of the court was a physical pressure, crushing him. Sign it. Be a king. Follow the law. Let your mate die. Alaric's triumphant smirk was the only thing he could see clearly. No. The word was not spoken. It was a tremor in his soul. The wolf, the primal, possessive beast he had chained down with duty and responsibility, was clawing its way free. It would not allow this. It would see this hall painted red before it allowed her to be harmed. But the king, the broken, weary man, knew that raw violence was Alaric's trap. If he attacked, he was a tyrant. Deposed. And Arya would still die. So he looked for another way. He stared past Alaric, his mind sifting through centuries of laws, of traditions, of forgotten loopholes his father had forced him to memorize as a boy. There had to be something. Some ancient rite. Some way to bypass a corrupt council and a forged truth. And then he found it. Buried deep in the old laws from a time when honor was valued more than politics. An option so brutal, so final, it had not been invoked in 200 years. But it had never been repealed. It was still the law. With every heartbeat, the plan formed. It was insane. It was suicide. It was perfect. He dropped the quill. It clattered on the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent hall. He rose to his feet. "You are right, Lord Theron," Lucian said, his voice quiet, yet it carried with an unnatural power. "The law is the law, and it offers one final appeal when a verdict is in question." He let his gaze sweep over them. Every lord, every captain, every single traitor. An appeal to the goddess herself, to let her pass judgment not with words, but with blood. He saw the confusion on their faces, all except Alaric, whose eyes widened in dawning horror. Lucian's voice dropped to a growl, the alpha in his tone leaving no room for argument. "There is another way." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Trial by combat." A collective gasp went through the hall. "The accused has the right to a champion," Lucian declared, his eyes locking with Alaric's, "to fight for their life and honor, and I, as king, invoke that right on her behalf. The accuser must accept the challenge, or confess his claim was made in falsehood." The trap had been sprung. He had turned Alaric's own political theater into a gladiator's pit. Alaric, a renowned warrior in his youth, had no choice. To refuse was to admit guilt. "I accept," he spat, his face a mask of pure, murderous rage. "Name your champion, Majesty." The court held its breath, expecting him to name Ronan. But Lucian had one more move to make. One more sacrifice. The courtyard air was sharp and cold, smelling of damp earth and fear. A ring had been cleared, circled by the entire court and half the palace staff, their faces pale and hungry for a spectacle. Duke Alaric stood on one side, already stripped to the waist, a wicked-looking broadsword in his hand. He was older, but his body was still a corded mass of a warrior's muscle. He was ready. But Lucien was not. Instead, he stood before the throne, which had been moved to the edge of the combat circle. He had summoned the council for one final proclamation. "For 8 years," Lucian began, his voice calm, resonant, "I have worn this crown. I have made choices for the good of the kingdom. I have sacrificed what was necessary." His eyes found Arya, watching from the high window of her tower, a tiny, perfect figure in a frame of stone. "I chose my duty over my heart once. I will not make that mistake again." Without another word, he reached up. His movements were slow, deliberate. He lifted the heavy, golden crown from his head, the symbol of his power, his burden, his prison. He held it for a moment, the morning sun glinting off its jewels. Then, he placed it on the seat of the throne. "Ronan," he said, turning to his commander, "until this matter is settled, you will act as regent. You will rule in my stead, bound by the old laws." Ronan's face was stone, but his eyes shone with a fierce, pained loyalty. He understood. Lucian turned back to the stunned court, and to a furious Duke Alaric. He began to unbuckle his own fine tunic, tossing it aside. He was no longer a king. He was just a man, an alpha. "I will not fight as your king," he declared, his voice a wild, liberated roar that was more wolf than man. The bond pulsed between them, a living current of fire and desperation. "I will fight as Arya's champion."
She watched from the tower as he took off the crown, watched as he shed the weight of the kingdom for her, watched as he offered his own life to pay for a crime she did not commit. Her heart didn't break. It solidified. It turned into a core of pure, unyielding fire. He would not die for her. Not like this. Not when she held the truth. She had to get her message to Ronan. She frantically searched her cell. There was nothing. No paper, no ink. But there was a small piece of charcoal from the hearth, and the inside of her prison shift was a blank canvas. She ripped a piece of the rough fabric from the hem. Her fingers flew, sketching the 2 seals, the old one with the tiny, telltale crack, and the new perfect one. Beside it, she wrote a single frantic word, artisan. But how to get it to him? The guards at her door were loyal to the captain, and the captain was loyal to the law Alaric had twisted. Then she remembered the boy, Lyra's son, a young runner who sometimes brought the prisoners their meager meals. His mother had lied, had condemned her, but the boy had always looked at her with wide, innocent eyes. Maybe it was fate. Moments later, she heard the scuff of small shoes. The food slot opened. The boy's face appeared. "Please," she whispered, pressing the scrap of cloth into his small, warm hand. You have to get this to Commander Ronan, not the captain. Only Ronan. Tell him the Queen's life depends on it. The boy stared at her, his eyes wide. Then he looked at the cloth, then back at her face. He gave a single sharp nod and was gone. Her knees gave out. She sank to the floor, her entire life, her entire world, resting on the speed of a small boy's feet. Down below, the combat was about to begin. Lucian and Alaric faced each other, swords raised. But just as the signal was about to be given, a voice cut through the air. "Wait!" It was Ronan. He strode into the center of the ring, holding up a hand. As regent, his authority was absolute. "By the old laws," Ronan announced, his voice booming, "all evidence must be re-examined by the regent before a champion's life is risked." He held up the forged letters in one hand, and in the other, a small smudged piece of cloth. He turned to the court. "Bring me the royal artisan," he commanded, "the one who serves the house of Alaric." Alaric froze. For the first time, a flicker of pure animal panic crossed his face. The artisan was brought forward, a small, trembling man. Ronan showed him the seal on the letters, then the drawing on the cloth. "Tell me, artisan, is this your work?" The man's eyes widened. "The seal, my Lord Regent. It was made with the Duke's old ring, the one with the crack. I made him a new one, a perfect one, over a month ago." Ronan turned, his voice like thunder. "A seal made with a ring the Duke no longer possesses, a forgery that could only have been made by someone with access to his old belongings. A lie." The world exploded into a roar of shock and fury. Alaric was exposed, trapped. His plot, his honor, his entire life lay in ruins around him. And in his ruin, he saw only one thing: the man who had caused it all. With a scream of pure guttural rage, Duke Alaric lunged, not with a politician's scheme, but with a warrior's steel. He lunged for Lucian. The trial was over. The death match had just begun.
Steel screamed against steel. The world narrowed to the space between two blades. But this was not the same fight as before. Before, he was a king, his movements measured, his mind split between strategy and survival. Now he was only an alpha, and his mate was watching. With a single glance up at her window, he felt the last of his fear burn away, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. He was faster, stronger. Alaric fought with the desperate rage of a cornered animal. But Lucian fought with purpose. "You have taken everything from me," Alaric roared, his broadsword swinging in a wild, clumsy arc. Lucian sidestepped the blow easily, his own blade a silver blur. "You took it from yourself," he countered, his voice a low growl, the wolf pressing forward, lending its strength, its speed, its senses to him. He could smell the sour sweat of Alaric's fear beneath his anger. He was no longer a king fighting a duke. He was a predator toying with his prey. As if fate demanded it, their blades locked. They were face to face, grunting with the strain, muscles trembling. Alaric's eyes were wild with hatred. "She will never be your queen. The court will never accept a gutter rat." "She is already my queen," Lucian snarled, and with a powerful twist, he disarmed the duke. Alaric's sword went flying, clattering uselessly on the stones. The tension broke. Silence fell over the courtyard. Lucian stood over the panting, defeated man, the tip of his sword resting against Alaric's throat. The crowd held its breath. The law was clear. The victor could claim the life of the loser. His father would have. The old Lucian would have. Kill him. End it. The thought was a whisper of the past. But then he looked up at the tower, at Arya. Her face was pale, but her eyes were full of strength, of trust. In him. In a single heartbeat, the world shifted. He knew what he had to do. He pulled his sword back. "Death is too easy a fate for you," Lucian said, his voice ringing with the finality of a king. "You wanted power. You wanted a title. so you will live with neither." He pointed the sword toward the castle gates. "You are stripped of your name, your lands, your titles. You are banished from these 5 kingdoms. You are no one. And if you ever set foot on these lands again, I will hunt you down myself." He turned his back on the disgraced, broken man. He didn't care about the gasps from the court or the look of shock on Ronan's face. Without another word, he walked away from the ruin of his enemy. He walked toward the woman who was his everything. He walked toward his future. He walked toward Arya.
Her breath caught. He didn't kill him. He had won. He had won with strength, and then he had won again with mercy. A true king. Her king. As he walked toward the tower, the crowd parted for him, no longer with fear, but with a new, dawning awe. Her legs were shaking so badly she could barely stand. The guards, their faces now full of shame and reverence, unlocked her door. She didn't wait. She ran. She ran down the winding stone steps, her heart pounding a frantic, joyful rhythm against her ribs. Down, down, down until she burst out into the cold morning air of the courtyard. And he was there, waiting. The world seemed to melt away. There was no court, no guards, no disgraced duke being dragged away. There was only him. His face was bruised, his knuckles were bleeding, and a stray lock of black hair had fallen across his forehead. He had never looked more beautiful. She stopped a few feet away, her chest aching with all the words she couldn't say. He took a step, then another, until the space between them was gone. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping away tears she hadn't even realized were falling. "It's over," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her own voice a trembling mess. A slow smile spread across his face, a real, true smile that reached his golden eyes and made her soul answer. "Not anymore." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not like the desperate, hungry kiss in the corridor. This was a kiss of homecoming, of promises kept, of a peace they had both fought and bled for. It was tender and deep, and it was a new beginning. When they finally broke apart, he kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. His gaze drifted to the throne, where the crown still sat, cold and alone. He walked to it, his hand still holding hers. He picked up the heavy gold circlet. The court watched, silent, waiting for him to reclaim his power. But then, he turned back to her. "This crown is a prison without you," he said, his voice so full of raw honesty it made her heart ache. "I will not be a king without my queen." He didn't place it on her head. He didn't need to. Her world tilted, not with fear, but with a profound, earth-shattering love. This was his final surrender, his true act of redemption. And her answer was the easiest thing she had ever said. She reached up and placed her hand over his on the crown, her fingers lacing with his. "Then we will rule together." Weeks later, the sunlight was warm and gentle in the royal gardens. Queen Arya of the 5 Kingdoms walked beside her king, their hands clasped together. She was no longer the invisible servant, nor the king's scandalous pet. She was a ruler, respected by the court not for her bloodline, but for her courage and her clever mind. She moved with a quiet confidence, offering a kind word to a gardener here, a nod to a passing lord there. Lucian watched her, his heart so full he felt it might burst. The haunted, angry man he had been was a ghost, a distant memory. She had healed him. She had saved him from his own crown. They stopped beneath the sprawling branches of the ancient willow tree, the place where a promise was once broken. "Do you remember what you said to me here?" she asked, her voice soft as she leaned her head against his shoulder. "All those years ago?" He smiled, wrapping his arm around her, pulling her close. "I promised you the moon." "You did," she whispered, her eyes shining up at him. "A silly boy's promise." "No," he murmured, leaning down to kiss her, a soft, lingering kiss that tasted of sunshine and forever. "It was a king's vow. I was just late in keeping it." Beneath the moonlight of their new beginning, he held his mate, his queen, his Arya. The story of a broken promise had become the legend of a love that had defied a court, defeated a traitor, and rebuilt a kingdom. The wind carried their names through the weeping branches, not as a lament for what was lost, but as a song for everything they had found. And they had found it all, together.